Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Arbiter of Worlds. Today, we're going to discuss one of the great challenges of tabletop RPG design and RPG game mastering: balancing player skill and character skill. According to the agency theory of fun, a good tabletop RPG should afford players the opportunity to make meaningful choices. But what determines the outcome of players' choices? Should it be the player's skill, or should it be the character's skill? This question comes up in every tabletop RPG, and very few games offer good answers to every variant of the question. Let me offer some examples. Example number 1. Mitch is an expert in Krav Maga, where he has learned how to disarm an intruder of a gun. His character Amderon is a mage. Amderon is currently being held at crossbow point by an orc. Mitch says, "Amderon knows it's a mistake to menace someone at close range with a firearm. I mean crossbow. Amderon leans back against the crossbow subtly, then spins sideways and grabs the crossbow before the bolt can skewer him." How does this get resolved? Does the fact that Mitch knows Krav Maga help Amderon get the crossbow? Example 2A. Ted is an expert in Axe and other D20 fantasy games. He has memorized every monster manual ever published. But his character Athelstan is a first-level cleric who's never left the temple before. Athelstan's fellow adventurer is about to enter a moldy room, and Ted says, "Wait!" Athelstan warns everyone to stay back while he steps forward to see if it's yellow mold. How does this get resolved? Example 2B. Luke has never played an RPG before, but his character Surius is a first-level mage with int 18 and knowledge molds and slimes. Sirius's fellow adventurers are about to enter a moldy room. Luke says, "Wait, does my guy know anything about mold stuff? Is it safe to proceed?" How does this get resolved? In other words, is Ted's player skill more important than Luke's character's skill? Example 3A. Chad is a highly successful business developer who teaches seminars on negotiation. But his character Rock is a barbarian with a charisma of 3. Rock is captured and brought before the king on charges of mayhem and vandalism. So Chad says, "Gracious Majesty, if I have erred in my deeds in your kingdom, it is only because of a surfeit of martial vigor that lacks a proper outlet. Pray give me a quest worthy of my skill at arms, and I will make right for you and your kingdom." How does this get resolved? Does Rock suddenly become eloquent and diplomatic because Chad is eloquent and diplomatic? Example 3B. Bob is a highly introverted theoretical botanist who despises human interaction. But his character Theodorus the Glorious is a bard with a charisma of 18. Theodorus is captured and brought before the king on charges of cacophony and seduction of the innocent. Bob says, Theodore says whatever is appropriate to say to a king. He offers to hold a concert in the king's honor, makes it sound like a big deal. How does this get resolved? Does Bob's lack of skill at verbal interaction matter, or does Theodorus's charisma matter? Example number 4. Jenna is a police detective in real life. She is renowned for her ability to spot the slightest disturbances in crime scenes. Her character Arlen is a dull-witted fighter with an int of 8. Arlen is searching a hallway for traps. Jenna says, "Arlen begins to carefully investigate the hallway. She subdivides it into 1 foot by 1 foot square sections and then scans each one looking for anything out of the ordinary. I'm talking disturbances of dust, strands of hair, tiny blood spatters, scuffs on the floor. We can go through this 1 foot square by 1 foot square at a time if you want." How does this get resolved? Does the fact that Jenna knows how to investigate a crime scene mean that her character Arlen is suddenly going to find information? Example number 5. Todd is a former Special Forces operator who earned a Bronze Star in war, and he has been trained to operate calmly in the face of danger. His character Bjorken, however, is a nebbish venturer with a will of 5. Bjorken has just encountered a powerful mummy with a dreadful aspect that puts paralyzing fear into the hearts of men. Todd says, "Well, freezing is the worst response to fear. To avoid freezing up, Bjorken begins to take a series of deep breaths and engages in a meditative practice that allows the fear to wash over him." How does this get resolved? Does the fact that Todd has been trained in breathing techniques to endure stress during wartime mean that Bjorken is therefore immune to mummy fear? If we want to take seriously the idea of player agency, we need to be able to answer these questions in a systematic way. Arbitrary decision-making on a case-by-case basis ends up depriving the player of the chance to reliably demonstrate skill, and also it deprives them of the chance to reliably use their character. In each of the examples above, the problem comes up because of a mismatch between the player's abilities, the player's knowledge and skills, and the character's abilities, knowledge, and skills. And there are 4 ways to address this mismatch. We're going to go into all 4 of them, and then I'm going to talk about how to apply my favorite of them. So method number 1, make character skill paramount. Under this approach, the game emphasizes that the player is not the character. The character skills are the only thing that matter in resolving what happens. This approach gets used in many story games that focus on conflict resolution rather than task resolution. In such games, even choosing to do tasks is abstracted away, and instead the success or failure of the entire conflict is left to the dice. And then the player's enjoyment is supposed to arise from role-playing how the character emotionally responds to these outcomes. It's also been used in some crunchy RPGs as a kind of backlash to some earlier game designs that emphasize player skill. An example here is the Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition skill challenge. That's an example. Now, this is not the solution that I recommend. Method number 2, you make player skill paramount. Under this approach, the player is the character, more or less. The player's skills are the character's skills. You want to hit a foe? You hit a foe by hitting a foe, hopefully with a boffer sword. You pick a lock by picking a lock. You negotiate with the king by negotiating with the king. The primary advantage of this approach is that it can create incredible immersion. By eliminating the barrier between the player and the character, the player gets to feel that he's really in the world. The secondary advantage, of course, is that if you are highly skilled, you get to show that off, and people enjoy gaining and demonstrating mastery. We see this especially in video games, where it's led to the rise of esports and Twitch. The disadvantage of this approach is that it precludes escapism, because a weakling who sucks at combat can never be a mighty warrior. A clumsy oaf can never play an agile thief. An awkward nerd can never be a charming bard. And since this sort of escapism is exactly what motivates many people to want to play an RPG, it becomes a poor choice for traditional RPG game design. However, it is widely used in live-action role-playing games. Or so we are told. None of us here at Arbiter of Worlds have ever dressed up in wizard robes and hurled socks at orcs while screaming fireball. Not even once. In fact, such claims are defamatory, they're malicious lies, and we will take appropriate action if they're brought up in the comments, because I hurled beanbags, not socks. In any case, this approach is also one I do not recommend. Method number 3 is to make player skill and character skill into non-overlapping magisteria. Under a regime of non-overlapping magisteria, character skill is paramount in some areas of the game, and player skill is paramount in other areas of the game. And which one matters depends on what you're doing. And this approach characterizes most old-school RPGs that favor rulings over rules. For instance, in the very first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the earliest set of rules, the game rules only covered a small number of aspects of play, primarily combat. And even mechanics that get taken for granted by the time of first edition, such as thief skills for finding and disarming traps, these rules don't exist. If a player wanted to search for a trap, that was resolved in just a back and forth conversation with the GM. And Matt Finch's quick primer for old school gaming is one of the best illustrations of this style. Gamers tend to either love or hate non-overlapping magisteria. Those who love it praise it for allowing player skill to shine through. They acclaim dungeons like Tomb of Horrors, which strove to challenge players to think beyond the limits of the game mechanics. Fans of this approach tend to see the parts of the game that have mechanics as actually less important than those without. Combat gets resolved with dice, so it's a matter of convenience. The best players, according to this approach, avoid combat. Rolling dice is a fail state. Now, those who hate this approach tend to slam it. They say it forces players to engage in Mother May I with the GM. These players find the subjective nature of this player-GM interaction to be a source of frustration rather than empowerment. They find this back and forth narrative of detailed exploration to be time-consuming and boring, and it gets in the way of the real fun, which is combat. They want to roll dice and kick ass with their plus 17 bonus. Okay, so who's right? Well, I believe that this non-overlapping magisterium is an unstable equilibrium. The history of RPG design has been that of games trending away from this approach and towards one of the others. Nowhere is this more visible than in the evolution of D&D itself. But that said, non-overlapping magisteria has many proponents, and the method can and has sustained decades of active RPG campaigning. So whatever its faults, it seems to be a favored solution for some gaming groups under some game masters. That said, despite the fact that most of the other games within the old school Renaissance adopt this approach, my own games and my own campaigns do not. Method number 4 is what we adopt. Method number 4 is the synergy of player skill and character skill. In the synergistic approach, both character skill and player skill matter. What happens in the game is not just a matter of one or the other. And I consider the synergistic approach to be the platonic ideal for role-playing games. And it's what I aim for in all of my designs. Unfortunately, it's mechanically hard to achieve, and it's conceptually kind of difficult to explain. Fortunately, if you're viewing this video, you are self-evidently a person of great acumen and intelligence who will have no problem following the explanation. So let's dive in. We'll start with physical tasks that require hand-eye coordination, muscle memory, mechanical aptitude, and other things that I lack. In the synergistic approach, the player is the instruction booklet, and the character is the guy following the instructions. So that means that the player can instruct his character on what to do, but whether the character successfully does do it is up to the character. To help illustrate the approach, let's consider a real-world example where my wife and I are building an IKEA bookcase. Now, the bookcase came with an instruction booklet explaining how to build it. My wife is reading me the instructions and I'm following them. And so she says, Step 5, insert gizmo A into plate B with gadget C. What happens? Now, there are some husbands who can just insert A into B using C. I cannot. I will find this beyond my mechanical aptitude, and I will just end up screaming that I never wanted a new bookcase anyway. Yeah. So in this case, in this analogy, the player is my wife, and the character is me, the husband. And I am failing to execute on my wife's instructions, on my player's instructions. Consider our earlier example number 1, where we needed to decide how much Mitch's expertise in Krav Maga is valuable to his character Amdaron's efforts to deprive a guard of his crossbow. So the player is the instruction booklet, the character is the guy following the instructions. We can imagine essentially Amdaron in his head is looking at a martial arts manual about how to disarm a crossbowman, and then he attempts to follow those instructions, and that gets resolved with a disarm special maneuver using Amdaron's characteristics. So I started with this example because it's the most straightforward to understand. It's the most commonly utilized approach for combat in all tabletop RPGs. Pretty much everyone understands the player makes the choices, the player gives the instructions, and then the character executes on them. Okay. The second thing the synergistic approach relies on is that the player has hunches, but the character knows facts, right? The player suspects, the character confirms. So let's consider example 2, right? In this example, we had Ted, the player, has concluded that the party's encountered yellow mold, but Athelstan, which is Ted's character, has no proficiency in identifying mold. On the other hand, Luke, the player, is a newbie. He has no idea what yellow mold is, but his character is an expert in ooze. And so how does the GM address this disparity? So in my game Axe, this situation is easily handled. Every player character has the adventuring proficiency. The adventuring proficiency, in fact, is actually developed to address exactly this situation. Because sometimes players know things, and the adventuring proficiency explains why players know the stuff that players know. It just represents the sort of broad but shallow know-how that gets picked up informally over time. So the adventuring proficiency explains why Ted's character Athelstan might know about yellow mold. He happened to hear a folktale about it once. His uncle Athelfred died to yellow mold, or he heard a rumor from another adventurer, whatever. Ted is therefore perfectly within his rights to have Athelstan say, wait, is this yellow mold? But what the adventuring proficiency does not do is confirm whether the mold that looks yellow is actually capital Y, capital M, yellow mold. To get the in-world factual confirmation, the character needs to have a proficiency, such as knowledge, molds, and slimes. So in the synergistic approach to data about the world, the player suspects, the character confirms. And to make this approach work, sometimes the player's suspicions have to be wrong. So in example 2a, an axe judge might respond, well, the mold has the color and texture of honey mustard. And if Ted then asks, does that mean it's yellow mold, like the monster that breathes death spores? And the judge is going to respond, Athelstan doesn't know. It might be, or it might just be mold that happens to be yellow. And then it's back into the party's court. Or the judge could say, the mold has a reddish color, like congealed blood. And then Ted is relieved it's not yellow. He tells the party they can advance. Sadly, the mold then explodes in a fireball. And there's no such monster as fireball blood mold in the monster manual that Ted read, but the GM has secretly created such a monster. He's placed it in his world. Now, notice here, the adventuring proficiency in the future would justify knowing about fireball blood mold, but it didn't now. In example 2b, the judge would respond something like, Sirius can make a knowledge proficiency throw. And then if the proficiency throw succeeds, then the axe judge is going to say, based on his expert knowledge of molds, Sirius is certain this is harmless mold. Or Sirius recognizes this as toxic mold. Or Sirius knows this is a never-before-seen species of mold closely related to the dangerous yellow mold. Or whatever. And then if the proficiency check fails, the judge can say, Sirius isn't able to identify this species of mold. Maybe he shares the info he shared with Ted about color and texture. Okay? So, let's talk about roleplay. With the synergistic approach, the player talks and the character translates. So we turn to example number 3. In this example, Chad, the player, has the real-life equivalent of high charisma and diplomacy, and Rock, who is Chad's character, utterly lacks these things. And then conversely, Bob, the player, has the real-life version of low charisma, but Glorious Theodorus, his character, has charisma 18. And both players want the character to persuade the king to favor them. How does this get resolved? And in the synergistic approach to interacting with PCs, I like to explain it this way. The player speaks, the character translates. The king, in example 3, does not speak modern English. He speaks classical Aran. Chad and Bob do not speak classical Aran. They speak modern English. So how are Chad and Bob communicating with the king? Rock and Theodorus are translating for them, from modern English to classical Aran. So Chad is a glib speaker of modern English with an 800 verbal SAT score. Rock is a terrible translator. When Chad says, Gracious Majesty, I have erred in my deeds in your kingdom. It is only because of a surfeit of martial vigor that lacks a proper outlet. Pray give me a quest worthy of my skill at arms, and I will make right for you and your kingdom. Rock says something like, Gentle King, I broke your laws because I'm strong and your kingdom is filled with weaklings. Maybe I could kill something for you since you can't do it yourself. And Chad doesn't necessarily know that's exactly what Rock said because he doesn't speak classical Aran. He just knows what he wanted Rock to say. And sadly, Rock's plea probably doesn't go too well, and that gets resolved with a reaction roll using Rock's charisma. Now, conversely, Bob is this taciturn, hesitant speaker, but his character Theodorus is a fluent and diplomatic translator. So when Bob says, say whatever is appropriate to say to a king, Theodorus translates that beautifully into the diplomatically appropriate wording. And again, Bob doesn't necessarily know exactly what Theodorus said. He just knows what he wanted him to say. And it probably goes well. Again, resolved with a reaction roll using Theodorus's charisma. Now, some people have a knee-jerk negative reaction to this approach. Players that are excellent actors who make an effort to roleplay their characters, and they'll say, this renders my efforts meaningless. It's not fair that Chad doesn't get rewarded for his roleplay. But I disagree. The player's words are not rendered meaningless by the synergistic approach. The character is trying to follow his player's intent to the best of his ability. And the game master is using the player's roleplay to figure out what that is. I will kill you if you cross me again never gets translated as, I will give you treasure, right? I will give you great wealth if you help me is never translated as, I will give you sex if you kill my friend, right? So in acts, the player's words are categorized by the GM as either diplomacy, intimidation, or seduction. And then the judge, the GM, applies different situational modifiers for each. And choosing which approach to take and figuring out how to take advantage of those situational modifiers, that's a matter of player skill. The player is the one who reads the room. He theorizes about the likely mindset of the NPC, guessing what might entice them or frighten them, and he uses roleplay to get that information, right? So this approach in no way makes roleplay unimportant. And if you've been watching my actual plays, they have tons of roleplay. But what it does do is give people like Bob a chance to enjoy playing someone they're not in real life. He could be a smooth and suave diplomat, or a frightening menace, or a sexy seducer, or whatever. Okay, so that's the synergistic approach to role play. Now let's look at the synergistic approach to perception checks. Finding traps, okay? Here the approach is the player looks, but the character sees. All right, so in example 4 earlier, Jenna, the player, is this fastidious police detective with world-class skills at searching a crime scene. But Arlen, which is Jenna's character, is a dumb thug with a sword. And so how does the GM resolve Jenna's detailed narration of Arlen's trap searching? So the synergistic approach to investigation, to searching, is built on 2 facts. First, some people are conscientious and diligent about performing long, detail-oriented tasks, and some people aren't. Second, some people are mindful of details, and some people are oblivious. In both cases, whether the task is completed successfully, it's essentially a stochastic output influenced by the person's conscientiousness, their diligence, their mindfulness. And I can give a real-world example of this: proofreading. Before I publish a rulebook, I send it to a proofreader for a thorough review. And that proofreader reads the book cover to cover, line by line, searching for errors. When they spot an error, I fix it. But nevertheless, errors creep in, right? And which errors? It's random. The proofreader's mind might wander on page 17 and miss a completely obvious typo, and then catch a really esoteric typo on page 71. And it doesn't matter how hard the proofreader tries. Some errors are inevitable. And as publishers, we can't predict the exact errors that'll be spotted, but we can reliably predict that if our best proofreader does the job, 95% of the errors will be spotted and 5% won't. Right? So you could model proofreading as a proficiency throw that succeeds on anything but a 1, for instance, right? Now, if a proofreader who is diligently reading a rulebook line by line with bright lights, coffee, a comfortable chair, an air-conditioned office, if that proofreader can't reliably find all the errors, why would we expect that a thief working in a shadowy corridor with a clumsy pole will automatically find all the traps? Just because a player wants his character to spend 10 minutes carefully plumbing every inch of the flagstone for cracks, that doesn't mean the character actually manages to spend every second doing so without his mind ever wandering. And it doesn't mean he actually finds all the cracks. But what's true for long and thorough searches? Also true for instantaneous awareness. The mind is bombarded with sensation, and it does not perceive all that it senses. If I misplace my keys on the kitchen table, they are effectively lost for all time. Until my wife walks up and she spends 0.5 seconds, and then she notices that they're in the fruit bowl near the large banana with the gray spots. And how she does this is unfathomable mystery to me. I can look, but she sees. No matter how much I look, I do not see. If I were a character, I would have a low perception score, or I would not be proficient in searching, etc. So this difference between making the to-do list and the doing, between looking and seeing, between listening and hearing, that's what you're modeling. And in Axe, I model it with searching and listening throws. And it's my judgment that this differential is where rulings not rules, where the Mother May I gaming style fails. Because it assumes that characters are infallibly mindful and attentive as long as their players say, my character is infallibly mindful and attentive. They aren't. No one is. But some people are better at it than others, and so therefore we want to model that some characters are better at it than others. All right, and finally, let's talk about morale, fear, okay? With the synergistic approach, the player is the prefrontal cortex. The character is the amygdala. So, the player is the soul of the character. Well, which part of the soul? Well, since antiquity, sages have known the soul or mind is fractured. Plato spoke of reason, spirit, appetite. 2,500 years later, Freud says superego, ego, and id. Contemporary neuroscientists talk about executive function in the prefrontal cortex, emotional response modulated by the amygdala. In the synergistic approach to player-character behavior, the player's skill represents the prefrontal cortex, and the character's skill represents the amygdala. If you prefer, the player is the ego, and the character is the id. And we can assume that most of the time, the player character is under the control of his reason, he's under the control of his executive function, which is bringing about rational, ends-oriented decision-making. But sometimes the player character might succumb to his appetites, to his id, to the activation of his amygdala. So that leads us back to example 5, where Todd, the player, has been trained to be calm in the face of danger, but Bjorken, which is Todd's character, is a skittish accountant. And in Acts 2, characters confronted by certain monsters have to make paralysis saving throws or be paralyzed with terror until the monster attacks or goes out of sight. So if we were playing that game, the way we'd handle it would be with a saving throw versus paralysis. Bjorken's low will would impose a penalty to this throw, even though Todd himself is a very calm and fearless guy. Mechanics like these do not detract from player agency necessarily, because the body's involuntary responses to stress are one of the challenges that the game world puts on characters. And it's up to the players to figure out how to work with or around that fact. After 40 years spent playing tabletop RPGs and 11 years spent designing them, I'm convinced, 100% convinced, that synergizing player skill and character skill in the manner I've described is the best choice for fun gameplay. It maximizes player agency. It still permits players to play characters who are different than themselves. All of my games are built around this approach, and I hope you will give this synergistic approach a try at your own game table. That's all for this week. Be sure to synergize with the like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment. Thanks for watching.